if you think being, spiritual means believing in spooky mysteries and ignoring science, well, you are about to have your mind blown.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there is this massive underlying assumption we all seem to carry when we talk about faith or religion.
Right.
It's this idea that at some point, to be truly devout, you just have to leave your brain at the door.
Yeah, you just have to believe.
Exactly. It's framed as something mystical, esoteric, like a feeling in your gut that inherently conflicts with the cold, hard logic of a laboratory.
It's almost universally framed as the exact opposite of the scientific method, We've been completely conditioned to think of a realm where logic and empirical observation actually get in the way of true devotion.
Right. But today, we are diving into a text that completely flips that entire framework on its head.
It really does.
We've been combing through the Tolu-i-Islam digital archive, acting as the lead scriptwriters to synthesize Lecture 715.
Yes, and this lecture specifically unpacks Surah An-Nahl, which is Surah 16 of the Quran, verses 77 to 83.
And the author, Allama Parwez, is laying out an argument for what he calls the empiricism of faith and the physics of flight.
Which is a wild title.
It is. And I have to be honest, when I first read this, I felt some serious cognitive dissonance.
Well, that dissonance makes perfect sense to me because it is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
We are looking at a historical analysis that argues the foundational texts of Islam don't just, tolerate scientific inquiry. They demand it.
Demand it as a prerequisite.
Exactly, as a non-negotiable prerequisite for actual faith.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because the author goes straight for one of the most misunderstood concepts, which is Habe.
Right, Cabe.
Now, usually when people hear the Quranic concept of Habe, they translate it as the unseen.
Which immediately sounds like a ghost story.
Totally. It conjures up fortune-telling, angels on clouds, invisible spirits floating around the room.
Yeah.
But Parwez argues it's actually about the hidden laws of science. And I have to push back here for a second because that sounds incredibly modern.
It does sound very modern.
Right. Are we sure he isn't just taking 20th century science and retroactively projecting it onto a 7th century text to make it sound cool?
It's a really fair question, and it's a massive leap for the modern reader. But the author argues this is actually the original, uncorrupted intent of the text.
Okay, how so?
Well, Parwez completely deconstructs the word Gabe. He acknowledges that over centuries, sure, it has been co-opted to mean the supernatural or the magical.
Right.
But in this lecture, he roots the word firmly in the physical universe.
They're not ghosts.
Not ghosts. Gabe refers to the unseen mechanics of reality. It is the laws of physics, the laws of biology, the underlying currents of sociology and economics.
Wow, okay.
We cannot see these laws with our naked eyes, but they govern literally everything around us.
Okay, I think I'm tracking. It's like dark matter or even just gravity.
Yes, gravity is a great example.
Right, because I can't look at my window and see quote-unquote gravity. Gravity is technically unseen. But I can observe an apple falling from a tree. And if I study that effect long enough, I can decode the hidden mathematical law behind it.
That is a phenomenal way to look at it.
Yeah.
The text's argument is that God established these hidden laws. This guide in humanity's fundamental purpose is to discover them.
To discover the science.
Yes, we are not being asked to sit in a dark room and conjure up blind faith. We are commanded to use our biological tools to decode these physical laws.
So faith is completely redefined here.
Completely. Faith, in this specific context, is redefined as the unshakable conviction that the universe operates on consistent, discoverable laws, not random whims or magical interventions.
Which naturally leads to the question of, well, what tools are we supposed to be using to discover all this?
Right.
And that takes us directly into verse 78, which starts with a claim about human nature that I found really surprising.
The blank slate.
Yeah. It says humans are born into this world as a complete 100% blank slate.
It states explicitly that you were brought out of your mother's wombs knowing absolutely nothing.
Zero innate knowledge.
Zero. No inherited wisdom.
But wait, that flies in the face of so many ancient philosophies. You have traditions suggesting we're born with a spiritual memory of past lives or original sin.
Or some kind of innate divine knowledge that you just have to meditate to unlock.
Right. But this text says, nope, you arrive totally empty.
Completely empty. But to navigate this complex physical world, you are explicitly given 3 biological cognitive tools.
And the lecture emphasizes that the order they are listed in is actually crucial.
Very crucial. First is hearing, which is Sam.
Okay.
Second is sight, which is Basar. And third is intellect, or mind, which is Fuad.
The sequence is highly deliberate.
It is, and the profound implication here is just staggering. A religious text is literally listing the tools of observation, hearing, and sight, and the tool of logic, the intellect, as the fundamental prerequisites for being a functioning human being.
That's wild. So hearing comes first.
Hearing comes first, which Parwez notes can represent the gathering of historical data. Think about it. Things outside our immediate visual range. The transmission of knowledge from previous generations.
Like reading the findings of others or listening to a lecture.
Exactly. Then comes sight, which is direct, immediate, empirical observation. You actually see the experiment in front of you.
But both of those are just data collection.
Right.
I mean, I can hear a loud bang and see a flash of light, but without a processor, that's just noise and brightness.
And that's where the third tool comes in. Fuad, the intellect.
The processing center.
Yes. Fuad takes all that raw sensory data and turns it into meaningful conclusions. Without it, the data is entirely useless.
The text actually uses a really visceral analogy to explain what happens when that third tool is missing, when you have the data but no processor.
The madness analogy.
Yeah, it discusses the clinical definition of madness. Parwez paints this picture. Imagine a person wandering barefoot on a road paved with melting tar.
Oh, it's such an intense image.
It really is. In the middle of a scorching May afternoon, the sun is beating down, the tar is literally burning their skin.
They have hearing, they have sight, their nervous system is actively sending extreme pain signals to the brain.
Right, the data is flooding in.
Flooding in?
Yeah.
But they don't step off the road to find shade.
Why? Because they lack the intellect, the fuad, to process that sensory data into the logical conclusion that, hey, I'm being injured, I need to move.
And that, according to the text, is madness.
The author is arguing that the Quran equates a lack of critical thinking with clinical insanity.
Exactly. You have the hardware, but you aren't running the software.
Therefore, the text is not demanding blind belief.
Not at all. It's demanding an empirical, logical approach to reality. If you just follow dogmas blindly without processing the data yourself using your own fuad, you are, in the text's view, abandoning your humanity.
I was trying to come up with a modern equivalent for this, and I was thinking about building a computer.
Oh.
If I buy top-of-the-line hardware, right, the most sensitive microphone for hearing, a 4K high-definition camera for sight.
The best specs you can get.
Right. It's completely useless if I don't install an operating system to process those inputs. It's just an expensive paperweight.
That's exactly it.
So, is the text essentially arguing that faith is the operating system built on logic?
That captures the mechanism perfectly. Faith isn't a feeling you get when you suspend reality. Faith is the output of a fully functioning operating system processing the realities of the universe.
Wow.
And Parwez points out a fascinating linguistic turn here. The verse ends by linking the use of these three tools to the concept of gratitude.
Now, wait, how do we normally define gratitude?
Well, usually it's just polite manners. Someone hands you a gift, you say thank you feel a warm, fuzzy feeling.
Maybe you say a quick prayer of thanks and you move on with your day.
Right, but the text redefines gratitude entirely.
How so?
In this framework, gratitude isn't a verbal utterance. You don't show gratitude for a hammer by saying thank you to the hammer.
You show gratitude by building a house.
Exactly. Gratitude is the tangible utilization of your observation and logic to produce beneficial results in the real world.
So if you don't use your brain, you're ungrateful.
If you're given hearing, sight, and intellect, and you don't use them to understand the universe and improve the human condition, you are inherently ungrateful.
That is heavy.
It is. Furthermore, the text connects the failure to use these tools to the concept of Kufr.
Okay, now Kufr is usually translated in English simply as disbelief, right?
Yeah.
Like ticking the wrong box on a religious census.
Yeah, exactly. But Parwez dives into the etymology. The literal root of the word means to cover up or to conceal.
Like a farmer covering a seed with dirt.
Yes. So to not use your brain, to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears, is to cover up the truth, to deny your own biology.
Think about what that means for you listening right now. We all have moments where we operate on autopilot.
All the time.
How often do you accept a piece of information blindly? How often do you forward an article just based on the headline?
Or accept a societal tradition just because, Well, that's how we've always done it.
Right. This text is arguing that true faith requires you to use the hardware you were given to verify everything.
It's a deeply empowering, almost radically individualistic call to intellectual arms.
You cannot outsource your fuad to a priest, a politician, or an algorithm.
You really can't. It demands absolute intellectual accountability.
And it sets the perfect foundation for what comes next. Because once the text establishes that we have the tools to observe and process, the immediate next question is, what exactly are we supposed to be observing?
Right. And the text doesn't tell us to look inward, close our eyes, and meditate.
It tells us to look up.
Yes, which brings us to the physics of flight.
So we move to verse 79, and the lecture points our attention to the birds suspended in the sky.
Now, for centuries, people looked at birds and thought, wow, it's a miracle they don't fall.
God's invisible hand must be literally holding them up.
Exactly. But the text insists they are not held up by magic. They are held up by the physical laws of the atmosphere.
Parwez's core argument here relies on understanding the mechanism of submission, doesn't it?
It does. He asks, why does the bird stay in the air? Because its physical structure, the curvature of its wings, its movements, they are all in complete alignment with the aerodynamic laws of the universe.
If you understand the law, you can fly.
Yes. And if you ignore the law, or if your physical body violates it, say, a bird breaks its wing and loses its aerodynamic symmetry, it crashes to the earth.
Because the law of gravity does not take pity on the bird. Gravity is entirely impartial.
Impartial and unrelenting.
Now, the birds are submitting to these aerodynamic laws instinctively. They don't know the mathematics of lift and drag.
Right. But humans are different. We don't have wings.
If we want to fly, we cannot rely on instinct. We must discover the laws using our fuad.
And Parwez doesn't hold back here. Keep in mind, he gave this lecture in the late 1960s.
Right around the time of the Apollo missions.
Exactly. He actually uses the space race and rocket ships as a theological proof.
Wait, really?
Yes. He says humans observe the birds, use their intellect to decode the hidden laws, the game of gravity, thrust, and lift, and we built spaceships.
We decoded the unseen and we went to the moon.
This completely fractures how we usually define the miraculous. We tend to separate miracles from physics.
Yeah, we think of a miracle as a moment where physics takes a day off, where water turns to wine or sees part without a physical cause.
But Parwez is arguing the physics is the miracle.
The fact that the universe operates on fixed, reliable, unchangeable laws that the human mind is capable of understanding, that is the ultimate proof of a purposeful creation.
So faith isn't hoping the laws of physics will bend for you.
Faith is having utter, unshakable conviction that these physical laws are reliable and won't suddenly stop working.
I love that. I'm picturing an astronaut sitting on top of a giant rocket filled with thousands of gallons of explosive fuel.
That astronaut isn't hoping for magic. They have ultimate faith in the mathematics of aerodynamics and combustion.
It really brings to mind an analogy Parwez uses in the text referencing Sir Isaac Newton.
Oh, the pebble analogy.
Right. Newton famously said towards the end of his life that he felt like a child playing with pebbles on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him.
Parwez argues that this vast ocean is the cave.
It's the infinite scientific laws, the physical realities of the universe, waiting to be understood by human intellect.
And the shoreline is simply the edge of human knowledge at any given time.
Beautifully put.
But I want to pause here because this is where the lecture takes a really intense turn.
It really does.
It's easy enough to accept that physics governs rockets and birds. If I build an airplane that disobeys the laws of aerodynamics, it crashes.
No amount of hoping or praying will keep an aerodynamically flawed plane in the sky.
Right. But Parwez takes this exact same empirical standard and applies it to human beings.
He says these unchangeable laws don't just apply to aviation, they apply equally to sociology and history.
Just as there is a physics of flight, there is a physics of civilization.
This is the pivot point of the entire text. Parwez transitions from physical laws to the laws of historical consequence, which he identifies as the law of requital.
The mechanism is identical, right? Cause and effect.
Exactly. If you drink poison, your biology breaks down and you get sick. That is a physical law.
Similarly, there is an inescapable law of cause and effect in human societies.
If you build a society on corruption, exploitation, and injustice, that society will inevitably collapse.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because this is where we all get incredibly frustrated.
Here for it.
If there is a social physics that guarantees corrupt societies crash, why don't bad systems just collapse overnight?
That's the big question.
Right. We look at history, or even the modern world, and we see dictators living long, comfortable lives. We see corrupt monopolies staying in business for decades. Where is the immediate gravity for them?
The text addresses this apparent delay head-on. It explains that God's days are measured in thousands or 50,000s of human years.
So it's a totally different scale?
Yeah. The hidden machinery of the universe, the social physics, moves very slowly. It operates in the gabe, the unseen.
Parwez uses a really powerful biological analogy to explain this mechanism, doesn't he?
He does. He compares historical change to a child forming in a mother's womb.
Oh, that's interesting because to an outside observer, for the first few months, nothing is happening.
To the naked eye, it appears completely static. The gestation is hidden.
But inside the womb, in the unseen, cells are dividing at a frantic pace.
Skeletal structures are forming. Irreversible biological processes are in motion. The law of cause and effect is working overtime.
And then suddenly, birth.
It appears to manifest in an instant, but it was the necessary physical result of a long, unseen process.
The text refers to the sudden manifestation of consequences as the hour, or As-Saah.
And Parwez points out that when the hour strikes, it seems to happen in the blink of an eye.
A government falls overnight. A market crashes in a single afternoon.
But that suddenness is an illusion. It's actually the tipping point of decades, sometimes centuries, of unseen preparation.
The law of requital was gathering data, balancing the ledger in the unseen, until the inevitable physical manifestation of the crash.
To illustrate how this slow, unseen preparation works on a human level, Parwez offers a deeply political, almost subversive interpretation of the narrative of Moses.
I'm so glad we were getting to this because this completely changed how I view the story.
It changes everything.
We usually hear the story of Moses as a series of magical interventions. The burning bush, the plagues, parting the sea.
But Parwez reads it as a masterclass in social physics and revolutionary preparation.
Let's strip away the mystical overlay and look at the mechanics of the story. First, we have to identify what Moses is up against.
Parwez points out three distinct archetypes of oppression in the Quranic narrative. First, you have Pharaoh.
Who represents absolute dictatorship and political tyranny.
Right. Then you have Haman.
Haman represents the religious priesthood, the institution that provides divine justification for the dictator's cruelty, keeping the masses docile.
Exactly. And third, you have Qarun.
Qarun represents monopoly capitalism, the hoarding of all economic resources.
So you have political oppression, religious manipulation, and economic exploitation.
The three-headed monster of a failing society.
Parwez identifies these as the three curses that oppress humanity. They operate synergistically to keep humanity enslaved.
Now, according to the law of requital, a system built on these three pillars is violating the laws of social physics and must inevitably crash.
But it doesn't just crash on its own, does it?
No, you need a catalyst. You can't just have a guy walk out of the desert with no background, wave a stick, and take down an empire.
The text points out that God arranged for Moses to be raised inside Pharaoh's palace as a prince.
I always wondered about the logistics of that. Why go through the trouble of hiding him in a basket just to put him back in the very house he's supposed to destroy?
Look at the mechanism of change. To dismantle a complex system of dictatorship and capitalism, you first have to understand its inner workings.
Right. Moses wasn't just enjoying the luxury.
He was observing the gabe of the political machinery. He was learning how power operates, how resources are hoarded, how the priesthood manipulates the public.
He was given a front-row seat to the vulnerabilities of the empire. He got an Ivy League education in oppression.
Okay, so he has the intellectual data. He's used his fuad to understand the system.
But then the story takes a harsh turn. After learning the intellect of the system, Moses is forced to flee to the desert, where he spends years as a humble shepherd.
And the text argues this wasn't a punishment for killing the Egyptian. It was necessary physical and psychological conditioning.
It goes back to cause and effect.
Parwez argues that the psychological makeup required to lead a fractured, traumatized, enslaved people through a revolution cannot be forged in a palace.
In the palace, Moses learned the theory.
But in the desert, tending sheep, facing the harsh, unforgiving realities of nature, dealing with isolation, he was building the immense physical and mental endurance required for leadership.
Wait, I can hear someone arguing, why couldn't God just magically give him endurance?
But based on everything we've discussed about the empiricism of faith, that would violate the physical laws of the universe.
You can't just download muscle memory or psychological resilience. It has to be earned through time and friction.
The universe was preparing him, slowly step by step, utilizing the laws of human psychology and physical endurance.
You need the deep knowledge of the corrupt system, plus the unyielding resilience forged in the desert to equal the downfall of the empire.
The preparation was happening in the unseen, the Gabe, until the moment Moses returned to Egypt and the hour struck for Pharaoh's system.
The social physics demanded a crash, and Moses was the aerodynamic force that brought it down.
That makes so much sense when you look at it as a mechanical process rather than a fairy tale.
It really does. But this brings us to a crucial pivot in the lecture.
Right.
We've established that bad systems crash because they violate social laws, just like a badly designed plane violates aerodynamic laws.
The oppression of Pharaoh, Haman, and Qarun was fundamentally unsustainable.
So, what does a system that obeys the laws of social physics look like? What is the aerodynamic equivalent of a healthy human civilization?
That takes us into verses 80 and 81, where the text does this beautiful deep dive into the transition from raw natural materials to human civilization.
It focuses on the economics of the home.
The Quranic text notes how God provides the raw materials: homes, tents made from animal skins and wool, shade from the trees, and garments or armor to protect us from the heat and the cold.
And Parwez pauses here to point out a foundational economic reality that we often completely overlook in our modern debates about wealth.
All raw materials, the light from the sun, the water in the rivers, the minerals buried in the earth, the animal skins, the wool, are given to humanity entirely free of charge.
Free of charge. No human being created them. No human being paid an entry fee for their initial existence.
They are the ultimate unearned capital.
The mechanism of civilization is what we do with that free capital.
The transition from that raw, free wool to a functioning tent or a protective garment, that is the story of human progress.
It is the application of human intellect, the fuad we discussed at the very beginning, applied to natural resources to create security.
I really want to linger on this because it destroys a lot of modern economic arrogance.
Let's say I build a massive, incredibly successful textile empire. I'm standing in front of my gleaming factories, wearing an expensive suit, and I might proudly say, I built this with my own 2 hands. I'm a self-made person.
But Parwez is essentially tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hold on a minute. Who gave you the complex neural pathways to design the factory?
Who gave you the opposable thumbs to build it?
Who created the genetic code of the sheep that grew the wool? Who provided the tectonic plates that formed the land you built the factory on?
We are basically taking credit for baking a cake and calling ourselves culinary geniuses when someone else gave us the fully stocked kitchen, the recipe, the ingredients, and the oven for free.
And that realization dictates how those resources should be used. Parwez argues that taking these natural laws of resources and turning them into social security, meaning actual shelter, clothing, and sustenance for the entire population, is the entire goal of the Quranic economic system.
The purpose of human intellect isn't to figure out how to hoard the free gifts of nature for a select few.
It's how to process them so everyone has a tent and a garment.
And the text gives us a masterclass example of this by looking at nature again. Just like we looked at the birds to understand the physics of flight, the text tells us to look at the bees to understand the physics of economics.
This is the hive economy analogy from Surah 16, verses 68 and 69.
The bee analogy is absolutely stunning when you unpack its implications for human society.
The text points out the mechanism of the hive. Bees travel vast distances, using their physical faculties to collect nectar from various flowers.
They apply their intellect, their instinctual biological programming, to process that raw nectar into honey.
But, and this is the critical juncture, they do not hoard it for themselves individually.
The individual worker bee doesn't set up a private offshore bank account for its honey.
It doesn't say, I flew the furthest, therefore I own 80% of this nectar.
They bring it back to a central communal treasury. Parwez uses the term Bait al-Mal, which is the historical Islamic term for the state treasury.
The honey is deposited, and then it is distributed strictly according to the needs of the entire hive.
The worker bees get what they need to maintain their energy. The guard bees get what they need to defend the hive. The developing larvae get what they need to grow.
Resources flow based on biological requirement, not based on who collected the most or who holds the most power.
And the text explicitly says that this bee system contains a healing for mankind.
Now, historically, people have read that and thought, oh, honey is good for your throat. It has antibacterial properties.
Which is true.
But Parwez interprets this on a macro level. He argues the system of the bees is the cure for the economic diseases of human society.
Adopting a system where resources are distributed based on need is the medicine that cures poverty, exploitation, and the inevitable crash of the social airplane.
If we follow Parwez's logic, it provides a devastating critique of human history.
If the laws of nature show us that physical bodies need nourishment and that resources should flow freely to maintain the health of the entire organism, just like blood flows to all organs or honey flows to all bees, why is human history characterized by mass poverty alongside extreme hoarding?
Why do we have billionaires while children starve?
Which brings us to the psychology of hoarding, covered in verse 83. The text tackles the political and economic systems that humanity has created.
It points out a dark psychological truth. People recognize that the raw materials and their own talents are gifts. Deep down, humanity knows it didn't create the earth.
Yet they deny this truth by hoarding the wealth for themselves.
Actively creating systems where a tiny fraction of the population lives in unimaginable luxury while half the world struggles to survive.
Parwez uses this framework to impartially critique the major socioeconomic systems of his time, which, still dominate ours.
The lecture views capitalism through this lens of social physics and argues it fails the test because it actively encourages the individual to claim absolute, exclusive ownership over the free gifts of nature.
It incentivizes and rewards hoarding.
This hoarding disrupts the natural flow of resources, starving the broader organism of society, which eventually leads to the collapse we talked about earlier.
It's an aerodynamic failure of economics.
Right. If one side of the airplane hoards all the fuel, the plane becomes unbalanced and it crashes.
But it's important to note Parwez is equally critical of the opposing extreme.
He explicitly states that systems like Marxism or Soviet-style socialism failed as well.
Why? Because while they correctly recognized the problem of hoarding, their mechanism for solving it was fundamentally flawed.
They tried to enforce equality using the stick. They relied on dictatorship, force, coercion, and state violence to redistribute the wealth.
Because you can't beat someone into sharing. Well, you can force them temporarily, but it doesn't build a stable, lasting society.
The resentment just builds up in the unseen and the habe until that system also crashes.
The Quranic view presented in this lecture is that a true, lasting socioeconomic system cannot be built by external force.
It must be built on an inner conviction, a psychological shift in human beings.
It goes all the way back to the intellect, the fuad. People must use their logic to realize that the hive economy is the only mathematically sustainable way to live.
They must willingly choose to distribute resources because they understand the social physics, not because a dictator with a gun is threatening them.
Faith, in this sense, is the internal logical realization that hoarding destroys society.
This raises a really uncomfortable question. How do people who hoard justify it to themselves?
Because nobody wakes up, looks in the mirror, and says, I'm going to be the cartoon villain today and starve my neighbors.
The text calls out the justificatory reasons people use to protect their wealth. And this is where Parwez gets really sharp.
It points out that wealthy elites often use religion as a shield. They say things like, well, God made them poor and God made me rich, so who am I to interfere with God's will? If God wanted them fed, God would feed them miraculously.
Parwez calls this out as intellectual fraud of the highest order. It is using religious fatalism to justify personal greed.
It was blaming the lawgiver for the fact that you are violating the law.
The text argues that God already provided the raw materials and the intellect to process them. That was the provision.
If people are starving, it is not God's mysterious will. It is the direct physical result of human hoarding and the failure to establish a just hive-like system.
Blaming God is simply a psychological defense mechanism to avoid sharing the kitchen.
Think about the logical gymnastics we use in our own lives to protect our comfort. How often do we say, well, that's just the way the economy works, or I earned everything I have entirely by myself, completely ignoring the vast public infrastructure, the free natural resources, the educational systems, and the societal stability that allowed us to succeed.
It forces you to realize that you are an active participant in the social physics of your time. You are either helping the airplane fly, or you are contributing to the aerodynamic failure.
It demands a level of self-awareness that is deeply challenging.
Extremely challenging.
Let's summarize the incredible ground we've covered today. We started by completely redefining faith. We explored how faith isn't a blind leap into the dark, but a process rooted in the biological tools of reason, our hearing, our sight, and our intellect.
If you don't process data, You aren't fulfilling your human potential.
Then we looked at the physics of the birds holding them in the sky, realizing that understanding the physical laws of the universe is the key to progress. The miracle is the physics. If you respect the law, you fly.
We then applied that exact same empirical logic to human history, seeing how unseen forces prepare the downfall of corrupt systems over long periods of time, using the psychological conditioning of Moses as a blueprint for dismantling oppression.
Finally, we arrived at the economics of the home, realizing that Social Security is built by understanding natural laws, recognizing that the Earth's resources are a free gift meant to circulate like honey in a hive, not to be hoarded through capitalism or forced through dictatorship.
It's an entire paradigm shift.
We've seen the tools of reason and the comfort of a stable home. In Lecture 815, covering Ayat 8490, we will see what happens when the witnesses are called, how a society's own history and actions testify against it when the law of requital finally takes the stand.
And as we leave you today, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If the universe operates on strict laws of cause and effect, and human society operates on those exact same unyielding laws, wait, let me rephrase that.
Sure.
If society operates on those same laws, what invisible seeds are we planting in our own society today, thinking no one sees them, that are slowly gestating in the Habe and waiting to be born into our reality?